Joseph Dombey. Joseph Dombey is not an American founder. I'm sorry to tell you that, though you come to this channel for American founders. He almost was the founder of the United States metric system. But Jason, there is no metric system in the United States, you say. Yeah, I know. It's because this guy got caught by pirates. Let's talk about it. Joseph Dombey actually was famous for becoming he was a physician, but he studied botany, and he became the #1 flower guy in France. He actually became head botanist at, and I'm going to mispronounce this, the Jardin des Plantes, which translates to Garden of Plants, in Paris. It was then, and I believe still, one of the most important, at least then, and maybe even now, one of the most important flower observatories in the world. I'm not sure what to call it. Botany places. He was a leading authority on vegetation, not just in France, but in the world. And then something interesting happens. Spain sends an expedition to South America, and it's called the Botanical Expedition to the Viceroyalty of Peru. And although it is led by Spaniards, Joseph Dombey is asked to come along because he has such a great knowledge. He's asked to come as an assistant. He would spend like the next 15 years in South America, and I'm going to breeze past this to get to the American part because I know that's why you're here. But he spends about 15 years in Peru. He collects a bunch of findings. He tries to send a bunch back to France. Thousands of species of plants he tries to send to France. It is captured by the British, and the British send it to Britain, where his findings are still in the British Museum, which I understand it's still called the British Museum. So the British in the 1780s captured a ship of this guy's findings, and they still have it on display in Great Britain, which I think is just a huge, a really hilarious kind of finger pointing, screw you from the British to the French. They still have it. Now, on another occasion, Joseph Dombey was still working with these Spanish explorers and botanists, and he wants to send more back, and the Spanish say, well, no, because it's our expedition, so we tried to let you send it back once, and you gave it to the British, so we're not going to let you do that again. It's okay. He keeps working, and eventually he ends up going over to Chile, where, I hope I pronounce this right, he goes to the city of Concepcion, which, while he's there, there is a breakout of cholera. And as a physician, as one of the few European physicians in colonial Chile, he is actually asked to take control of the situation. I saw him called physician-in-chief, but I couldn't confirm that that was actually the title given to him. But he was essentially put in charge of overseeing this epidemic that broke out in the city, and he spends a year helping the people, successfully helping the people find their way through the disease. After this, he does more research on plants while he's there, and ends up sailing with them back to France. But when he gets to Europe, he first stops in Spain, and the Spanish authorities there say, no, you can't have this. And again, he has his findings taken from him. Now, this time, I don't know if he gets all of his findings, but he gets most of his findings back because he promises not to publish his work before the leaders of the original expedition he was on. He agrees that I was part of a guest on a Spanish expedition. I will let the Spanish leaders of that expedition publish their findings, then I'll publish my work, which he does, and again, he becomes very important. The thing is, he arrives back in Spain just as the French Revolution is breaking out. Now, fortunately for this guy, he didn't concern himself much with politics, he just liked plants. And the National Assembly that took over the government and started beheading people, they were okay with Dombey. And I'll remind you that the French Revolution was an entire revolution. It wasn't just a political revolution. They were trying to change society at large. And this is where the metric system comes from. They actually wanted to change how things were measured. They came up with a new calendar that didn't last, but the metric system they created is still used by most countries in the world. And side note, the United States, although we don't really consider ourselves a metric country, much of what we use is based in metric. It's just translated then to our form of weights and measures. But this is about the same time the Constitution was getting passed, which gave Congress the ability to determine weights and measures. And hey, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson had the ear of George Washington, and he was friends with France. Now, he had met Dombey briefly. Dombey gets back just before Jefferson leaves, but although Jefferson knows him mostly as character, mostly by his reputation, he really loves France, and he hears France is trying to do this new thing of weights and measures. And since the United States has to come up with a new version of weights and measures anyway, and just like they're coming up with new coinage, they're not using the pound. Actually, they were considering using the Spanish dollar. Again, at the same time that the United States becomes one of the first nations to use a decimal system with their money, and so is France doing pretty much the same thing. So they say, hey, why don't you send us over some examples of your metric system? And the thing is, when they created two things in France, well, they send two things to the United States. They send a copper rod that was 1 meter long, that was made with the other meters and measured with the meters, and then they send something called a grave. Now, the name grave would be changed to gram a few years later. It doesn't weigh exactly what a gram does say, but it's approximately the same thing. And they send this grave over with the meter so that the Americans can investigate it and determine if they would really like to follow the metric system. Unfortunately, they give it to Joseph Dombey, who sails towards the United States and before he arrives is captured by pirates. Well, they called themselves corsairs. That's a sexy name that, what I believe what British pirates gave themselves, although usually we associate corsairs with North African pirates. So it might be a little lost in translation because it was originally written by a French person to an American. Now, Dombey, unfortunately, is captured. He's brought to the Caribbean, where he's treated pretty poorly and then dies fairly quickly. Now, it is difficult to determine if he dies because of his poor treatment or if he dies because because he caught a disease he was not accustomed to. Though, having lived in South America for a long time, he should have been seasoned, as they call it, or called it. People would kind of die when they came to North and South America pretty quickly, but if you survived a year, you were generally seasoned, and you would have been all right. Now, although Dombey dies, his luggage doesn't die, and in fact, these corsairs, as they call themselves, they look through all the luggage. Of course, pirates want to take goods, but they see something. They see Dombey's baggage, and they see it is addressed to Secretary of State of the United States of America, Thomas Jefferson, and they don't want to mess with that. For whatever reason, these pirates or corsairs or privateers, they did see themselves as honorable people. Judge them as you will. And they decided to send it back to the United States. They actually send the luggage back. Now, it gets to New York. By the time it gets to New York, Thomas Jefferson had resigned his position, and Edmund Randolph had taken over as Secretary of State. But he gets these baggages that are addressed to Jefferson. And so this weird correspondence goes on that I was reading through where Randolph writes to Jefferson, hey, do you want this? And Jefferson's like, well, no, it's okay. And you can auction it off or do what you want. And then Randolph doesn't really know what to do with it. And then the meter disappears. I'm not sure what happened with the meter. But the grave, aka the grave somehow ends up in the hands of Andrew Ellicott. Now, Andrew Ellicott is the premier surveyor in the United States. And we've spoken about him before, but just as a reminder, Andrew Ellicott, by this time, had finished the Mason-Dixon line, had done the borders of essentially almost every state. He resolved the borders of almost every state west of the Mississippi. Pennsylvania, he's the reason Erie, Pennsylvania is part of Pennsylvania. He is finalized, would go on. The last thing he would do after this is finalize the border with New York and Canada, just literally find a border in the United States, and he probably was involved with finalizing it. So somehow, and I was really spent a lot of time trying to trace this and could not figure it out, but somehow it gets from Edmund Randolph to Andrew Ellicott. Again, as for the meter, that one kind of disappears. The grave, though, stays in the family, the Ellicott family, for like 150 years. It's donated to a museum in the 1930s or 50s. Somewhere in the 20th century, it's actually donated. So extraordinarily interesting. What's even more fascinating is after Randolph no longer has it, you find Thomas Jefferson in letters saying, man, I really wish I got that. And it's like, no, dude, you had written to Randolph and told him to do what he wants. You should have said, hey, send me the grave and send me the meter. While I can't say this is why the United States never had the metric system, this is essentially why it was not implemented right off the bat. Of course, it wouldn't necessarily have been had it arrived appropriately. But it certainly wasn't done then because of this. So that is the story of Joseph Dombey. I stumbled onto it. I know he's not an American founder, but I found it an extremely fun story. I sure hope you did too.